Have you ever wondered why some relationships feel intoxicating, magical, almost too good to be true at first, only to slowly erode over time? What actually makes a narcissistic relationship so compelling? And why is it so hard to step out of the dynamic once you're in it? And really, what is a narcissistic relationship? What does that mean? Today, we're so fortunate to be joined by someone who brings a grounded, thoughtful, and deeply seasoned perspective to these questions. We have Gordon Brewer with us, host of the Practice of Therapy podcast, licensed therapist, private practice owner, and coach for more than 20 years. Gordon also has years of experience working with couples, which gives him a unique window into how narcissistic dynamics actually play out in real relationships. Hello everyone, welcome to the Narcissism Decoder. I'm your host, Dr. Anthony Mazzella. In this conversation, Gordon and I dive into a topic that's everywhere on social media. What exactly is a narcissistic relationship? And what does it truly mean to be in one? We explore how these relationships evolve, what makes them so appealing at first, and the subtle ways they start to shape, and sometimes distort, a person's internal world. We had a full agenda, and we didn't get a chance to fully unpack a few important questions, such as, what does healing look like? How do you begin healing? And why healing yourself, whether you decide to stay or leave the relationship, is so necessary and important. Those are a few of the questions Gordon and I will be going into on his podcast, so definitely stay tuned for that. Anyway, we did cover a lot of ground today. As I mentioned, I had a tall agenda. There were so many questions I wanted to ask Gordon, knowing his level of experience. But rather than telling you, let me just take you right into my conversation with Gordon. Hello, Gordon. I'm so excited to have you here today on the podcast, and I want to thank you for taking this time to come on and talk about what I think is a really complicated concept or topic, which has to do with narcissistic dynamics and narcissistic relationships. So welcome to the podcast, Gordon.
Well, so glad to be here. I'm honored that you asked me to come on your show.
Yeah, of course. So look, maybe we could start in a very broad way, and then from there, we'll sort of let this unravel and see how deep we could get into this. So maybe a good place to start is you could just tell us or tell my listeners, like, what sparked your interest in understanding these narcissistic relationships or narcissistic dynamics?
Right. Well, I've been in private practice as a marriage and family therapist for over 20 years now. You know, it's a dynamic that comes up quite often. And particularly being a male therapist, which is a little unusual in that I think for therapists, we're probably like 25% or male or whatever. But I really got interested in how people interact with each other. I would see what seemed to be kind of narcissistic tendencies in relationships to show up. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a male narcissistic partner with a female narcissistic partner. It can be the reverse as well. And you see that happen as well. And so just really got interested in how these interaction patterns unfold and just looking at, you know, the stories behind the people that are in these relationships and how they develop. And so all of that became very fascinating for me. And as you know, narcissism is a tough one to crack, particularly working with people that have narcissistic tendencies. There's not a lot of willingness to want to change those things. And so then working with the kind of the people on the receiving end of those relationships of really helping them to develop the autonomy that they need and how to navigate those types of relationships. And even ultimately deciding, okay, do I want to stay in this relationship or not? Which is always a big question that comes up.
Yes, absolutely. So before we even go in that direction, I want to ask you just, when you mention that you see these narcissistic dynamics, again, we're just starting very general, just so we have a mutual understanding of this. What does that even mean? Again, just for the audience or the people who are listening, like what are narcissistic dynamics or what would you tend to see in these couples that you were working with?
I think for one, the person on the receiving end tends to be a little bit of a wallflower, so to speak. They have this feeling of walking on eggshells a lot and feeling like they are, A lot of times there's a lot of self-blaming. Well, if I just didn't make these mistakes, then they wouldn't be so mad at me, or they wouldn't try to be that sort of thing. Also seeing a tendency to really define themselves in the relationship based on the response of the narcissistic partner. In other words, they don't really know what their own autonomy seems to be. See that quite often. And also just not knowing how to say no to things. In other words, they will tend to do everything to please the partner who has those narcissistic tendencies and not really be clear on what it is they want for themselves. And so they have a hard time with those kinds of boundaries. And so there's just, at least for me, kind of a real imbalance of power within the relationship. Yeah.
Okay, let's stay with this. This is already getting interesting, which I thought it would, okay? Because I want to compare this to what I see. So a couple comes in, I'm just sort of reviewing what you say. And in general, this is just in general, you could see one person maybe in the relationship who's more dominant, more in control, maybe has more power. And the other one, I think you used the phrase like a wallflower, which means they're not really feeling confident enough, right, to speak up or to assert their own sense of autonomy. So they come in, what sort of presenting complaint? Like, what's the problem? In other words, what even brings them in? Because I could imagine this dynamic that you just described for mutual reasons. It's not pleasant. I'm not saying it's pleasant, but it's worked out for them for many years. So I'm imagining something must have shifted or something happened that brought them into treatment.
Right. Well, a lot of times it can be something like an extramarital affair has occurred. And the narcissistic partner says, well, I want to change. It won't happen again. There's some fear of losing the relationship or the relationship breaking up. Okay. That's one scenario. It might be even that the abuse in the relationship has escalated to the point where it's gotten physical, or somebody's actually gotten hurt, or there's a risk of losing children, or unfortunately, for a lot of times in narcissistic relationships, it's usually at a crisis state at which they seek out therapy. Yes. Because a lot of times they're just kind of navigating it and maybe not even realizing they're in a narcissistic relationship. Oh, yes. And usually, unfortunately, it's usually some sort of big life transition event that tends to be the catalyst for people coming to therapy.
And I imagine this is where it gets very complicated because, again, I see this in my practice quite frequently as they come in. And even though you identify this dynamic, this power differential, and now let's just stay with your first example with the affair. But it gets more complicated quite quickly. And I'm not sure how far down this rabbit hole we want to go, but I'll just sort of open it up, which is, because this is the stuff that I hear, is that if you have a wallflower, like that kind of partner, the husband in this example, prototypical example, often feels like there's nobody there, that he's not getting whatever narcissistic supply, sustenance, affirmation, whatever it may be, that he's no longer getting. And this does change, by the way, over the course of a relationship. Oftentimes people come in and they do find a partner who's very willing to be the cheerleader and their biggest fan, but then things change over time. But then now you see it gets complicated because you have a man on the one hand who's complaining. So it's not even like he's the identified patient who had the affair, but as it unravels, it's like, wait, where was she in all of this? And this is, I imagine, I don't know if you've seen this, Gordon, but now I would imagine you have to juggle this in a very, very sensitive way. Because on the one hand, his behavior overtly was far more damaging than her behavior. However, we could say hers is more covert and maybe his is more overt. But I wonder if you run into something like that where then they're just blaming one another for what led up to the affair.
Right. That happens. That's pretty typical, I think, with a lot of situations. And that's where just that therapeutic relationship really comes into play in terms of, particularly working with couples, being able to build trust with both people in the relationship and getting to a place where you can hopefully get them to recognize, okay, this one person's done this really bad thing, but that didn't occur in a vacuum. And being able for both people to recognize, okay, what is my part in this? What am I contributing to the relationship that might have created this kind of chasm between the two people? Now, like you said, if you've got a narcissistic person, that makes it very complicated because a lot of times people that have those narcissistic tendencies have a real hard time taking on their own responsibility for themselves. They're constantly looking for an external locus of control. Everything they do is based on either reacting or responding to everything outside themselves rather than paying attention to what's going on internally that
Yes.
they actually have control over. Yeah.
So, okay, so much is going on in my mind. Let me just calm myself down, but let me keep going. Because you mentioned something here, like if you have someone who has these narcissistic tendencies, it's hard for them to step into a more reflective space where they could even begin to think, what did I do? How harmful was this? And what comes next? Like sort of what led up to this and what can I do, let's say, to repair the damage? But on the other hand, I would imagine, again, simultaneously, because you mentioned couples, and this is always tricky work, is you said the wife in this prototypical example may not actually be so innocent, right? Maybe the way she's pulled back and she's a wallflower and not as invested in the relationship also inadvertently, right? It's not to say that this guy wouldn't have done it ananyway, or maybe he would have done something else, who knows?
Right.
But inadvertently didn't help but contributed. So now she could, I imagine, would feel blamed and be like, look, I am the victim here. How is it that you could possibly consider, right, or even suggest that I played some role in this dynamic? So I wonder if you bump into that at all.
Oh, yeah. Again, all the time. It's a matter of really getting people to a place of really understanding how their interaction patterns play off of each other. I tell couples all the time, I really don't care that much about what you're arguing about, but really looking at how you argue and that dynamic of what happens.
Yes.
So if one person comes on really strong and really gets aggressive in an argument and the other person just kind of backs down and they keep pursuing them, that just perpetuates the problem.
Yes.
Whereas you get people to a place of where they are better emotionally regulated within themselves, then they can begin a dialogue about what's going on. Yeah, there's so many different, as you know, so many different rabbit holes we could go down here with these different dynamics. But I think as much as anything is really looking at getting people to a place of looking at how they're responding to their partner, of really looking at what they're doing. With a narcissistic partner, the difficulty is of course, there's usually a lot of gaslighting that occurs. There's sometimes a lack of empathy for their partner's situation, what they're going through. And so really trying to get people to a place where they can understand the other person's internal world in a way that is seen with compassion, as opposed to seeing it as a threat or seeing it as a criticism or, get on the defensive. One of the classic patterns in relationships is a pattern of criticism and defensiveness. And so that just cycles through, getting them to change that up, of being able to get curious about their partner's internal world. And so I think that's, at least in the work that I do, is I try to get people to that, is to really ask questions in the session that, the person that has had the affair, asking them, okay, what do you think it feels like for your partner right now? This thing has happened. So what's going on for them internally? What would you guess that's like for them? And so that really begins to change the dynamic a little bit to hopefully elicit some empathy with each other around that.
Let's take a quick break.
Are you tired of feeling like you're walking on eggshells all the time? Do you feel drained, confused, or like nothing you do is ever good enough? Are you stuck in a cycle of elation, then criticism and confusion? If any of this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And that's exactly why I created Office Hours with Dr. Anthony Mazzella. That's me. Office Hours is a low-cost, small group space where you could bring your questions about narcissistic traits and dynamics and the places where you feel stuck. You'll be met with honest, grounded feedback. I'll hold the group with structure, but there's also space for a real conversation. This is a space designed for anyone looking for clarity, insight, and support. If that sounds like you, just click the link in the show notes to join us. Okay, I hope to see you there. Yeah, and in my field, the psychodynamic word for that is mentalization. I don't know if you've ever heard of that, but it's the capacity to not just reflect on one's own thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, but the thoughts and feelings of somebody else.
Right.
That's complicated stuff. So I really appreciate you saying that. And I can't emphasize enough how much I also appreciate, because for the listeners of my podcast, they hear me talk about this stuff all the time, like becoming curious, trying to understand your partner's or somebody else's inner world. But to hear it from somebody like you, outside of me, someone who's built a successful profession and podcast around this, hopefully lends a little bit more credibility to something that I've been saying, because you and I may think this sounds very reasonable and makes sense, but the unfortunate piece is there's a lot more out there in sort of the social media world that what I would say oversimplifies this. And it's very comforting and comfortable to blame somebody else, that there's a bad guy in the relationship. I'm virtuous. I'm always there. I've been a good wife, again, in this prototypical example, and he's the bad guy. And when they come in initially, and I'm sure you see this as well, there's a lot of, again, this is what we call, this is part of splitting, by the way, and we see a lot of splitting like that. So when you're advocating, I'm just saying it in a different way to drive it home for anybody who's listening, is a more integrated approach, which unfortunately is a little more complicated as well, because now you introduce thinking of somebody else's thoughts and feelings, but also trying to get to know somebody and their inner world, which is not easy, because now that's a level of closeness that relationship may have never had. Because if it is a narcissistic relationship, which we both, I think, would agree, and to some extent exist more in fantasy than reality, that's the whole cycle of idealization and devaluation. So really getting to know someone is grounded in reality, which pulls them out of the fantasy. No easy place to be. That's not easy, but...
Right.
Let's even go one step back. Again, in your work with these individuals, do you find there's anything in particular, if we could say there's like a narcissistic partner, a non-narcissistic partner, even though I think that's a little bit arguable and gets a little more complicated because it's not that black and white. See, that's part of the splitting as well. That means one partner is bad, the other one is good. But putting that aside just for a moment, is there something that you find that typically compels people to get in this kind of relationship? Like when, let's say, the non-narcissistic partner comes to you, I think my husband is a narcissist. Is there any thought about, if in fact he does have these characteristics or these tendencies, is there ever any thought or consideration of what was so appealing? What attracted him to you? Or what was even going on inside of you at that point in your life when you entered into a relationship like this?
Right. Yeah, I think, kind of in my way of thinking about things is I think people tend to pick partners that somehow seem familiar. And so if a person has come from a family where maybe there are narcissistic tendencies or parents that were narcissistic in some way, that seems familiar. They kind of get the rules behind that and they know how to respond. And so there's kind of this unconscious, I guess, attraction to that kind of person.
Yes.
But on the flip side of that, people that are narcissistic can be very charming, particularly when a relationship is developing. Being able to say all the right things and being able to play into a person's needs and being able to do a lot of love bombing and that sort of thing. And that can just kind of build the attraction. I don't have any way, I'm sure there are people that could be classified as narcissistic, that they go into it of just thinking, okay, I'm going to win them over. I'm going to pull them into my side. But I think there are some incidences where they do it kind of unconsciously. That's the way they operate with people, is that they learn how to manipulate people. And they do it not only in their primary relationships, but probably many of their other relationships as well, in their workplace. And they do that
unconsciously. I just want to underline that it's not, maybe sometimes it's more that malignant type of narcissism where there is clear motivation to do this. But oftentimes, at least the people that I see in the cases that I study, it's more what you just said, Gordon. It's an unconscious motivation that they're trying to get something from this person, but it's not like they have conscious malignant intent. And you see this so frequently because when you start to show them the impact that their behavior had or how it could be interpreted in different ways, they're pretty stunned, actually, like sort of befuddled even sometimes. Like they just don't see it, but when they see it, And that's part of the rewarding work and has to do with the healing process, which we'll save for maybe part 2 of this, okay? But when they do see it, it is quite shocking to them because, like you were just saying, it's not always at that conscious level of awareness. But go ahead, I jumped in because I just wanted to highlight that because it's so easy just to fall again into that trap of, look at what he did. They intentionally manipulate you. And that's the reason you need to get away because they're evil. So just trying to loosen that image up a little bit.
Right. Yeah. I think the term narcissism and what we've come to think of it is it's such a negative connotation about people. But the thing is those personality traits don't develop in a vacuum. I think it happens, they learn to be that way based on what they're growing up in order to survive, in order to feel safe in the world. And so that's what they kind of learn growing up. And so then it carries on over into adulthood. And hopefully people that have those tendencies become more aware when they're faced with life struggles within relationships, because that's where it happens is in relationships, or just constantly in conflict or constantly in struggle with people, and then becoming aware, okay, what's the common denominator? Well, hopefully the narcissistic person will recognize, oh, this is about me, and these are things that I can begin to work on and change. So
like just like an example of that would be something like, I'm imagining this as you were saying, that something happened developmentally along the way. And this is just one way to define narcissism, again, because it's so complicated. But one way to define it is that their self-esteem is precarious. In other words, that they don't have a solid sense of self, a solid sense of identity. So if that is precarious and they don't know how to feel good from within, because they never had that kind of environment where they internalize whatever, we won't go again into too much theory, but then of course they're going to be looking for that externally from their environment. And that's where that whole word of narcissistic supplies comes in, that constantly they need something from their environment to shore up their sense of self and their sense of identity.
Right. And I think typically, going back to thinking about relationship dynamics, and this is where, how people tend to, I think, get paired sometimes, is that if a person has grown up, and I see myself this way, full disclosure, is see myself as a helper. And so a lot of my internal motivation is to help people. And if I can see myself as helpful in situations, that somehow or another raises my self-worth, in that, oh, I've been helpful. Look how good you've been. Look how helpful and I can hear my mother and grandmother in the back of my mind, just talk about what a good boy, you did these nice things for people. Well, if somebody comes along that is very needy and needs my help or wants my help, oh, that's a good matchup in a way. Yeah. And so then those two people begin to play off of each other. So the narcissistic becomes kind of more of the taker, whereas the helper becomes more of the giver. And then over time, that builds resentment for the helper, and then the narcissistic person just takes advantage of it. Yeah.
Dwell on that just for a second, because let's say you do get in this relationship and you said, I do feel good. I feel good helping. Why would you start to resent it over time? I mean, you're getting something that feels good to you. Like, what happens there, I guess, internally that you would start? If you don't want to make it so personal, Gordon, that's fine.
That's fine. Yeah. No, I think that what happens is the helping becomes unrecognized and also becomes expected. And so then there's the resentment that builds around that. It's kind of like I give and give and give and get nothing in return. I don't get rewarded for that, because I think ultimately any human behavior is that the reason we do anything that we do is there's some perceived payoff for doing it that particular way. And so, being helpful as a kid, you learn, okay, you're helpful. Oh, good boy. Get the pat on the head, and that makes you feel good about yourself. Yes. But if that goes on and on, and you don't get that reciprocal, reward, or you've done this nice thing for me, let me do something nice for you kind of thing, that's where the resentment gets built in.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, it makes sense. That makes complete sense. And I would add just one other thing to it as I was listening, which is, oftentimes, if you really are with a partner who has these narcissistic characteristics, at the end of the day, they have a hard time accepting the help. So it's not even that they just, what you said, Gordon, is true. They may not reciprocate because they just don't think of you in that way. The whole relationship is that you're there for them. It's like a one-sided relationship. But also, when you do sit down and you try to help them and you go over the plan at whatever it might be that it seems like they came to you for help and they were genuine. And then the next day, the whole thing flips and it turns out they didn't even hear a word you said. Or as you're trying to help them, they speak over you, they speak louder, or they get defensive, or they tell you why this isn't going to work. That too becomes very frustrating, because at the end of the day, again, if you're with someone who truly has these characteristics, it's very hard for them to accept and take in something of value from somebody else for a number of different reasons. But one reason is that means that you've enriched my life. And if you enriched my life, that means that I have a need. And again, if someone is really narcissistic, they are without needs, because they're sort of above all that, and having needs and vulnerabilities is just too dangerous.
Right, right. And it sets up, kind of that classic double bind situation where, a person will say, well, I want this from you. You don't show me enough affection. I want you to be more affectionate with me. And though they go to do it and they show the affection, and then they get rejected for giving the affection. And so, it's a no-win situation.
Yes. Yep. So I think you're getting into this, but I'm being mindful of your time, and I probably want to start wrapping it up soon. But just for the listeners, Gordon and I spoke a little bit, and I realized I had a lot of questions for Gordon because I was so excited to have him on the podcast. And I said to him, I don't think we're going to get through all of these, but I want everyone to know that next week I'm going to be on Gordon's show. So I think what we're going to do is, what we didn't cover was, what makes somebody vulnerable? I want to say a little bit more about that. Like, what makes someone vulnerable in terms of getting into this kind of relationship? And then over time, how does this begin to erode, or wear away your own identity, your own sense of competence, your own voice, going back to the wallpaper that you mentioned, Gordon, a little bit earlier. So we didn't get to that. And finally, what I love to talk about the most is what leads to genuine change and healing. Anybody listening, it's always up to you whether you decide to stay or to go. But whatever you decide, no matter what, Gordon and I still need to talk about healing, because if you can heal, it is possible, then you're freer to make a decision whether you stay in this relationship or you inevitably leave. So I think that's a pretty robust agenda, which we could kick to our next recording, if that sounds good to you, Gordon.
Yeah, that sounds great. Sounds great. We'll do kind of a podcast swap here.
Yeah, this is great. And then I like this because it allows us to just have a little more space, like we're doing today, just to say, wait a minute, hold on. Let's go into this a little bit further. And we'll do some of that on Gordon's show next. And I'm going to put your link as well. Well, actually, maybe that's a good way to wrap it up. First, you could tell us, maybe, is there anything that we missed or anything that you want to review or really drive home before we wrap it up? And then where can people find you if they want to take a bigger interest in your work?
Sure. Yeah. Well, I think, that you bring on a really good point, Anthony, in that a person ultimately needs to decide for themselves where they want to be, like you said, stay in a relationship or leave the relationship. That's their decision to make. That's a lot of, I'm sure, the work you do, and also the work I do, is really helping people navigate that, which is, there's no right answer to any of that. But to get back to what you asked, people can find me if you'll go to practiceoftherapy.com. I have a podcast of that same name, The Practice of Therapy. It's really geared more towards therapists and just helping them navigate all the ins and outs of being in private practice. But I love having guests like Anthony, where we talk about clinical issues and that context, and just how we do that kind of work with people, because I think people find that interesting, particularly other therapists. Just hearing how another person approaches a problem is real important. Also, you can find me in the psychcraftnetwork.com is the URL for that. But any of those, you can reach out to me and contact me and shoot me an email. I'm just Gordon at practiceoftherapy.com. And then also you can find me on the various social media channels and that sort of thing.
Gordon, you're all over, Gordon. I love it. And I'll put this information in the show notes as well, just so it's there. Thank you. A very big thank you. I appreciate you, Gordon, for coming on the show. And I really appreciate the mature way, the balanced and mature way you think about these things. So until next time, okay? Yes.
All right. Sounds good.
All right. Bye. If this spoke to you and you're curious to learn more about all issues related to narcissism, please support the show by subscribing so you don't miss what's coming next. And even more importantly, take a moment to leave a review. Reviews make the podcast easier for others to find, which helps the show grow. The more the show grows, the more I can invest in creating thoughtful content that supports you in understanding and navigating your experiences with narcissism. Okay, thanks for being here with me. I'm grateful we got to explore this one together. Until next time, take care of yourself. Bye for now. Disclaimer alert. The Narcissism Decoder podcast is provided for general information purposes only. The content presented in this podcast is not intended to diagnose, treat, or cure any psychological condition related to narcissism. The content on this podcast should not be considered a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. For specific advice pertaining to narcissism or any other psychological condition, you could reach me directly. I am an experienced mental health practitioner who is always taking on new patients. If you would just like a consultation, I can do that too.